Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our second social studies lesson in our online learning journey during this coronavirus season. Last time we talked about Native American tribes from the Central and Mountain Plains region. We're going to jump just a little bit ahead, and we're going to talk about Texas and the Civil War. So, here is our joke of the day for social studies. And it is a picture of General Robert E. Lee, who was the general for the Confederacy during the Civil War. And it says, "Civil War jokes, I don't generally find them funny." Ha ha! So funny. Okay. Our do now. Write 2 to 3 things that you can recall about the Civil War on a piece of paper. Any 2 to 3 things. You can pause the video if you need to, but if not, we're going to move straight ahead. So, our job today, our TEK is TEK 4.4a. The student understands the political, economic, and social changes in Texas during the last half of the 19th century. The student is expected to describe the impact of the Civil War on Texas. So our objective is the learner will identify 3 impacts of the Civil War on Texas. So, slavery in Texas. Texas became the 28th state in the United States in 1845. But 16 years later, Texas would decide to leave. What happened? Like people in other southern states, many white Texans had different beliefs from people living in the northern United States. The most important difference was about slavery. African Americans had come to Texas with the first settlers, but they did not come freely. Planters from the South brought them as slaves. As slaves, African Americans worked for people who bought and sold them like property. A small number of free African Americans had settled in Texas before it became a state, but most African Americans in Texas were slaves. Their labor helped to build the state. Most African American slaves worked on plantations. A plantation is just a large farm that produces crops to sell. Enslaved men, women, and children labored long hours in the fields. Others worked in the house and at trades such as carpentry and blacksmithing. Whatever type of work they did, they were not paid and they had no say over their lives. Now we're going to be looking at population changes and growth of the cotton industry. So, by 1860, 3 out of every 10 Texans were enslaved African Americans. There were more than 182,000 African American slaves in the state. The chart shows, the data that I put on the PowerPoint shows how the population distribution changed between 1836, where 13% of the population were enslaved African Americans, up to 1860, where 3 out of every 10 Texans, or 30% of the population, were enslaved African Americans. The percentage of enslaved people increased greatly, as you can see. One reason for this change was the growth of the cotton industry. In the 1850s, the demand for cotton was growing. Much of it was exported to countries in Europe and to textile mills in the north. For Texas landowners, this was good news. As cotton passed through the Texas ports, Texas planters earned more and more money. As a result, they needed more workers to grow and pick cotton. These workers were African American slaves. Only 1 in 4 Texas families owned slaves, but many people in the state believed slavery was important to the economy. The North and South disagree. The issue of slavery had divided the United States from its beginnings. By the mid-1800s, many Anglo-Americans in the South believed in slavery. They said their agriculture depended on slave labor, but a growing number of Northerners opposed slavery. They believed all people should be free. People who wanted to end slavery were known as abolitionists. Some Texans were abolitionists too. Tariffs were another issue. A tariff is a tax paid on goods that come from another country. The North had many factories, and tariffs helped them sell goods. Their goods were less expensive than imported goods that were taxed. Since the South had few factories, tariffs did not help their economy. Instead, tariffs meant that people had to either pay more or buy Northern goods. They felt that that was unfair. Northerners and Southerners had different ideas about states' rights, too. Many Northerners believed national laws applied to everybody, to every state. Many Southerners, on the other hand, felt states could nullify or cancel laws they had disagreed with. For example, what would happen if the United States decided to outlaw slavery? Southern states wanted to be able to nullify such a law. In 1860, the United States elected a new president, Abraham Lincoln, who was against the spread of slavery. Many people in the South strongly disagreed with Lincoln. In fact, many Southerners began talking about leaving the United States. Next, Texas secedes. In December 1860, just a few months before Lincoln took office as president, South Carolina seceded from the United States. To secede is to officially leave or separate from a group. One by one, other southern states followed South Carolina. In January 1861, Texas called for a convention to decide if they would also secede. A majority of the 174 delegates were slave owners. At the convention, delegates protested, quote, the insults, threats, and aggressions, quote, unquote, of the North. In the end, more than 46,000 Texans voted for secession. Still, almost 15,000 Texans voted against it. Notably, Sam Houston was one of the Texans who opposed secession. However, on March 5, 1861, Texas officially seceded from the United States of America. 11 southern states, including Texas, formed a new government. They called it the Confederate States of America, or simply the Confederacy. The Confederacy named Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as president. Now, President Lincoln did not accept states seceding. He said they were still part of the United States. Lincoln promised to do everything he could to keep the country together. This side, or mostly northern states, was called the Union. The map shows how the country was divided. The chart does not show anything because there is no chart. Now, the 11 states that seceded from the Union were Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, North and South Carolina, and Virginia. Next, Texas goes to war. On April 12, 1861, the first shots of war were fired at Fort Sumter, a Union fort in South Carolina. That was the beginning of the Civil War, also called the War Between the States. Although both sides thought it would be over quickly, it lasted 4 bitter years. Its cost in human lives was terrible. Almost all the fighting took place east of the Mississippi River. About 90,000 Texans fought for the Confederacy. Many Texas soldiers joined units or groups from their hometowns. Since Texans had a long history of riding horses, many Texas soldiers joined the cavalry, or a group of soldiers who fight battles on horseback. Texas soldiers served in almost every battle. The war had a direct impact on Texas's port cities. During the war, southern states wanted to ship cotton out of Texas ports. They also wanted to import supplies and arms into the ports. But Union ships set up blockades along the Texas coast as they had at other southern ports. A blockade is an effort to stop ships from going in or out of a port. Many Texas cotton growers got around this by shipping cotton to the Rio Grande Valley and then out through Mexico. As the war went on, Texas soldiers faced troops in several battles along the coast. In October 1862, Union troops captured Galveston, the state's largest port. By January, though, Confederate soldiers had taken it back. In September 1863, Texas soldiers met Union forces at Sabine Pass. The Union forces pulled back after the attack. Later, Union forces lost the Battle of Laredo. Colonel Santos Benavides led the Confederate soldiers at Laredo. He was the highest-ranking Mexican-American who served in the Confederacy. The promise of freedom. The war continued on. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This document declared that, quote, all persons held as slaves, unquote, in the Confederacy were free. Emancipation is the act of freeing someone. When a president makes a proclamation, it is an order. Of course, the Confederacy was not acting as part of the Union, so slavery was still the law in the South. Slavery was not outlawed in the United States completely until after the war ended, but the stage was set for slavery to end in the United States once and for all. On the home front. The Civil War impacted Texas in many ways, both on the battlefield and at home. By the end of 1863, most free Texas men had left home for the war, so many women ran their households alone. They took care of farms, ranches, and businesses until their husbands returned. Children helped too. Women were also active in the war. Some sewed uniforms for soldiers. Others ran or worked in hospitals for the wounded. Everyone had to live with shortages caused by the blockade. From food to clothes to medicines, Texas families could not get many foods they counted on. People did what they could to deal with the shortages. For example, people spun their own fabric and made their own clothing. And when they needed paper to write something down, they used wallpaper. And for everyone left at home, one of the greatest hardships was worry about the men who were fighting. One Texas woman wrote, "Sorrow is added to sorrow. War makes its widows by the thousands." The war ends. By 1865, the Confederate Army was worn out and the Confederate economy was broken. The loss of life was overwhelming. Almost 50,000 Confederate soldiers were dead or wounded, 24,000 of whom were Texans. After many hard battles, the Union finally won. In April 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant in the village of Appomattox Courthouse near Richmond, Virginia. But other Confederate forces fought on. On May 13, 1865, Texas troops defeated Union soldiers at the Battle of Palmetto Ranch near Brownsville, Texas. It was the very last battle of the Civil War. The Union victory in the war kept the country from breaking apart forever. The Civil War also ended slavery in the United States. In 1865, the 13th Amendment made slavery illegal in all states. The Civil War was over, but it would take the country many years to heal. Alright, so our review today was to identify 3 impacts of the Civil War on Texas. So, your MOL is on Google Forms. This is graded. You'll find it in your Google Classroom under this lesson tab. Now, your assignment for this lesson is an Achieve 3000. It'll be under Social Studies, and the lesson is titled Freedom for All. You will have 7 vocabulary words: amendment, civil rights movement, college, convince, politics, separate, and slavery. So, please review those words and their definitions before you do the assignment. Also, take a look at the before reading poll. You must complete stop and jots, your after reading poll, and the math activity. Optionally, you can do the stretch article and activity and the thought question. Finally, you have an extension activity. You can choose one of the 4 major battles of the Civil War that were fought in Texas and research it. Write a paragraph with 5 to 6 complete sentences about the battle you chose. You should include, at minimum, the name of the battle, where it took place, when it took place, the generals on each side, and the number of casualties and wounded soldiers on each side. If you are able, please submit it into Google Classroom. Alright guys, nice job today with this lesson. Keep working on it this week. If you have any questions, you can make a comment in Google Classroom, or you can email me or message me through class tag. Keep working hard. I know that things are difficult right now, but I'm so proud of y'all.